Buenos dias, good day to you. I hope you don't mind me sliding some more things about Mexico in the videos, like the tile making that goes on in Mexico. Mexico has a beautiful tradition of making tile like this. You have all kinds of different tiles there. The one on the bottom is basically a mosaic. It's a bunch of smashed up tiles and then pieced together. And the plant pot is also made kind of a tile. It's called talavera. It's a certain art style down here. The floor is tile as well. Beautiful tile work, and here's some tile work that I'm kind of proud of. This is my tile work. I made this barbecue here. I actually copied how Mexicans make it. It's got some pieces that are falling off it right now that I'm going to be working on down here, these kinds of pieces. But you can do all kinds of things with tile. I made a sun. Yeah, I made a sun out of tile. It's a beautiful artistic, cultural tradition here in Mexico. And if I were to ask you what kinds of cultural, artistic traditions you have local to you, where you're living in Pennsylvania or New York or New Jersey, what would you answer? Would you answer a hoagie, for example, in Pennsylvania? In New York, what would you say? Would you say the Yankees? What would you say? It's very interesting, is it not, that each and every country has cultural traditions. Excuse me while I move over to get a better lighting in the video. Isn't it interesting how media, therefore, can play a role in preserving culture, or perhaps even promoting culture? Or does culture die? Would you even know about tile making? Did you know that in Tannersville, Pennsylvania, there was a huge leather making and leather dyeing tradition, and that's why it's called Tannersville. That's what you're doing, you're tanning. What happened to that tradition? Why don't we know about it? What about ice making? In the Poconos, there was a lot of ice making that went on for other areas of the region before people had refrigerators and ice makers in the refrigerators. It was made in the Pocono Mountains. What role could media be doing, could media be playing to preserve those traditions? That's kind of what we're taking on today in our chapter as we move away from the part of the world that we've been talking about, Canada, the US, Brazil, Mexico, and now we're moving over to Europe. Going to be discussing Europe in the next few days, and this chapter that we're dealing with today is really about the European Union in terms of its policy regarding media. So European Union media policy is what we're talking about in this chapter today. And do you know about the European Union? Do you know what it is? Do you know what the flag looks like for the European Union? It's a dark blue flag with stars in a circle, and each one of those stars is representing one of the countries that belongs to the European Union. It was founded in 1993, and it is a collection of European nation states, or European countries as you might think of them. Originally, it was started right after World War II, the European Union, to create economic cooperation amongst countries in Europe as a way of trying to stave off war in the future. The thinking was that if countries were big trading partners and they relied on each other for their economic well-being, that they would be less likely to go to war with each other. And so it started out as an economic union. In fact, it was called the European Economic Union originally, until it started to branch out into other areas and started to cover other areas like trade and free trade. I remember living in Europe when the borders finally came down and you could go between Germany and France, for example, without having to present your passport, just fly right on through. That's all part of policy to promote free and open trade in the European Union. The European Union also, though, expanded into other areas like human rights, like in making sure that human trafficking is covered in the news, for example, as a means of exposing human injustices that are taking place. And so the European Union really started to become a much more comprehensive umbrella, if you will, for all of the European countries that belong to it. And belonging to it is not just something you sign up. You have to go through a long application process, and you have to prove that your country is going to abide by European policy. So the European Union it supersedes each individual government in the UK, for example, or in France or Germany or in any of the countries that belong. The European Union supersedes those governments in some ways, but at the same time, those governments are still operating independently. So one of the areas that the European Union does cover, which you have to follow if you're going to be a member of the European Union, are the media regulations. Yeah, the European Union actually has media regulations, and they enact that through a legislative framework discussed in the chapter, and that legislative framework has got three components to it. It's got a European Commission, and those are positions that are like administrative. They formulate overall policy, and they administrate the European Union, so it's like an administrative body. The real teeth of the legislative framework, though, are in the European Parliament. The European Parliament has members that are elected from each individual nation state, and then they serve in the European Parliament. And then there's also a Council of Europe, which also develops policy. Those three areas, the Council of Europe, European Parliament, and the Commission, make up the legislative framework. And one of the directives, as they call it, that they rolled out was called the Audiovisual Services Directive. And this Audiovisual Services Directive provides very specific funding in the areas of media literacy and media pluralism. Media literacy and media pluralism. We're going to define what those are a little bit later in the course, but let me just bring in an example here. I remember watching television in France and seeing this documentary-like show where they went to a small village and showed how a certain kind of cheese was being made that you can only buy in that village. Now, let me tell you, the French have so many different cheeses, and for me, I love cheese, so each one of them is really attractive. And so watching a program like this was fascinating, seeing this tradition and the clothes that they wore dating back centuries, seeing this tradition described. I mean, I would like to know how cheese is made if it's told in an interesting way. And that's what that did. And so this is an example of media policies that are providing funding for a television documentary to handle cheesemaking, because if it was left up to the commercial market, no television station, no television production company is going to produce a documentary on cheesemaking, because it's not going to be profitable. It's going to be for a very, very tiny audience. It's not going to be, they'd rather make something like The Big Bang Theory to try and capture many more people, and you're not going to have culture, therefore, being preserved. You're not going to have tile making in Mexico preserved unless some media form takes it up to try and pass it on to the next generation by producing media content about it. In addition, the legislative framework, talking about general areas that it handles, it promotes online content as well, and trying to break down some of the barriers to get legacy media content to be distributed online and to allow people to have equal access, broadband access to online content. But it's kind of tricky because nations like Britain, can always leave the European Union if they don't like the regulations, and that's what Britain did, right? That's what Brexit was. Britain left the European Union over issues like this, being told what to do. And so it's always a balancing act when the European rolls out policy. But in the general areas that they are able to regulate that other countries agree to are advertising is one of them. And when we're talking about advertising, they have some very unique techniques that they require broadcasters to employ so that advertising is clearly separated from regular content. Because that's the worry here, is that when you're watching news, you have a completely different mental framework going on than when you're taking in advertising. When you're watching news, you're trying to assess the truth. You're trying to look at the sources of the material. You're trying to think about whether you agree with what's being reported on. When you get to advertising, though, it's a very different kind of mindset that you're in. You're almost in a kind of like a defensive posture to make sure that you don't get sucked into purchasing something that you don't need, but at the same time, you're really, really interested in it. So that's what advertising is worried about when it comes to the European Union. And so they force television broadcasters, for example, to include a bumper between regular programming and advertising. A bumper could be a graphic of the television station, the logo. It could be a quick bird flying across, like that bird right there, flying across a horizon. It's something to provide a wall in between regular content before you go over to advertising, so that it doesn't just sneak in there, and particularly with children's programming. Children not able necessarily to discern between when they should be really, really careful about what they're watching not in terms of being in danger, but about the claims that are being made in advertising, especially if it's trying to get them to purchase cereal or some kind of toy that's associated with a Disney product. Children don't have that ability to discern when regular programming, the Disney show, finishes and an advertisement for the Disney product comes in. So this is one of the areas, and there are many more regulations with advertising too, like the word free. When can you use the word free? You can't use the word free if there is actually a cost associated, an application fee or anything of that sort. Of you're offering a contest for a free cruise to the Caribbean, it's not free if you have to pay an application fee. So that's one of the areas covered by the European Union. Another area is major events. If there are major events, and a lot of these events are considered to be sporting events, like World Cup soccer or the Olympics, or a big hockey match between, say, Sweden and Russia, those kind of events are to be made open to the general public and not just carried on pay-per-view cable. So that's a public service in a way, making those major events accessible. It's a form of media literacy, making events accessible on media. Protecting children is another area. I've already mentioned that, protecting children, but there are lots of rules in place about protecting children. Sweden has some of the strictest rules in the world when it comes to advertising in children. You're just not allowed to advertise towards children on television, and you're not allowed to use children in television. I don't know if you ever saw the E-Trade ads in the United States where you had two babies talking, but they were talking like adults, talking about investing in stocks. That would be totally illegal in Sweden because you have children who are acting in that. And another area is the promotion of European films, similar to Canada, which is also fighting back this deluge of American media content coming in. So is the European Union. And so they promote European films, and about 42% of those monies that they apply for this go to France. France, I mentioned before, has a big filmmaking industry. All right, so now let's go into some media-specific programs. These are programs created by the European Union to promote the policies that it's wanting each nation to abide by when it comes to media operations. And one of the media-specific programs which is provided funding for is called Creative Europe. And that's to stimulate creativity. There's a lot of homogeneity in media programming out there. If you watch television, sometimes, for me anyhow, in the United States, it seems like one sitcom is just very similar to the next one. It's got a laugh track, the jokes are very similar, characters stay within safe boundaries. Creative Europe is designed to get away from things being done routinely and to have a new creative approach to producing media content. Another media-specific program is, I'm going to have to move here, the sun's starting to creep up a little bit too much for me here. Another media-specific program offered by the European Union is financial subsidies. Financial subsidies for print media. So print media today have a hell of a time making it, right? Hardly anybody reads a newspaper anymore. And if they do, they want it to be online and they want it to be for free. We're so used to reading things for free. And yet newspapers must remain viable, especially in democracies. It's where people can really study issues. You can study issues in a newspaper story much better than you can learn those issues in a television or a radio story, or I wouldn't necessarily say online, but certainly the way that people use online media is. The newspaper plays a very special role, and so there are subsidies for newspapers in European countries, and those subsidies sometimes just mean that the train network that's available in a country is paid for by the government to carry newspapers from where they're manufactured, say in Paris, into the outlying regions of the country. And so it's a subsidy. It's where the government supports an operation. In this case, we're talking about a subsidy for newspapers. Next up, in terms of media-specific programs, is state aid for film and television. So a lot of money goes from the European Union towards state aid that is then allocated to promote film and television. And one of those areas, and this is the fourth media-specific program, which benefits very much from this kind of approach, is public service broadcasting. Public service broadcasting, that's broadcasting that is for the public. Now, you may think that you have plenty of that in the U.S. You may think, for example, the nightly network TV news is public service broadcasting. Well, It's not when it's profit driven. It can't be, because everything that is decided content-wise has one goal in mind, and that is to get the audience to be as big as possible. And so it's not really a situation where the public's best interest is in mind. The stories on a television news program in Philadelphia, for example, I got to move again. Let's try over here. All right, so on a television news program, let's say you're watching Philly news on any TV news, most of the stories are going to start off as a crime story or a fire story in a city. And that's because those kinds of stories lend themselves very well to being covered by television, and they're very visual, right? If there's nothing more visual than a burning house. And yet, is that really in the public's interest? If the public is starting to be afraid almost every single day of going out of their house because they believe that crime is greater than it is, that's not in the public's interest. So public service broadcasting is funded across Europe, and the way that it is normally done is through a license fee. A license fee is where, when you buy a television set, you go into a national registry, and then you must pay a fee of, in England, it's around $400 a year. And that fee is collected by the government, and then they apply it to the public service broadcasters that are operating in that country, and as a way of giving them funding so that they don't have to rely on advertising, which then starts to bring down the level of quality of content in many ways, certainly intellectually, because the less people understand a program, the less likely they will be to watch it on television. So you got to dumb it down. Right? We call that the lowest common denominator. That's what happens when you have advertising that's involved. And so in Europe, you have a strong push to make sure that when a person picks up that remote control and they start going through the channels, that they're going to come across many public service broadcasting options. In Britain, you've got the BBC. In France, you've got France 2 and Quatre. Not Quattro, that's Spanish, the Channel 4. They have several French channels that are public service broadcasters. Same in Sweden. These are broadcasters that, for the most part, don't run advertising, although France is different. They run advertising on their public broadcasters. But for the most part, these are free and clear from advertising interests influencing the content. I'll just give you one more example. Disney owns Disneyland and Disney World. And Disney also owns ABC News. So if a person is injured on a Disney roller coaster, let's say even in the worst case scenario, they're killed, is that story going to be covered by ABC News, or will it be buried because there's a financial interest there? Who would know? We never see any stories on people who are injured on roller coasters covered by ABC at Disney. So we just don't know. Have there ever been incidents like that? We just don't know. And so that's what public service broadcasting is supposed to avoid. It's supposed to be in the public's best interest. And that takes us now to the two broad areas where the European Union is trying to make progress in its policy. And one is in media literacy. That's the ability to access media through the means that we talked about earlier, through broadband, but also not having prices break down. You shouldn't have to subscribe to a television station to watch a soccer match, for example. That's not providing access, and that's not providing literacy. And then there is this Center for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom that has been established in Florence, Italy, if you know about that city. I've been there a couple times. Florence, Italy, beautiful medieval city. And they have a Center for Media Pluralism to try and promote that it's really good that you have as many voices in your media as possible. Again, to talk about France as an example, after World War II, that was the second time that France had been overrun by the Germans, and really very quickly. Like France, conceded right away, surrendered, some may say. And France decided that one of the reasons that happened was because there was a lot of monolithic commentary in its radio, meaning that a lot of people were talking about the same thing in radio, and the same thing that's being alluded to here is being sympathetic to the Germans. And that allowed the French, not allowed them, but that caused them to be defeated. And so after World War II, France developed a policy of saying that any new radio station that's applying to have for radio frequency must prove that it adds to the pluralism, must be a different voice, a diverse voice. So in France, you can actually listen to anarchist radio. You can listen to fascist radio. You can listen to Jewish radio. You can listen to Black French radio. Every kind of content that comes down the pike to be applied for must contribute to that pluralism. And along with that is the European Union's attempts to eradicate hate speech, to get rid of any speech that is racially insensitive or offensive or even injurious, and to try and do that in areas that we are also trying to handle in the United States. Would be ethnic relations, relations for gendered people as well, relations between poor and rich people, between city people and country people, or suburban people. It's to try and people who are quote unquote thin, people who are quote unquote not thin. These are all people who have been subjected to hate speech over the years, and the European Union has policies in place to make sure that this doesn't happen in its media. And one of those involves the Ombudsman, the same position that we talked about in Mexico, a person who represents the public. You often find an Ombudsman in European media. All right, so that does take us to making some concluding comments about the European Union and its policies. And one is that the European Union continues to deal with convergence. Convergence is also something we're dealing with in the United States. Is basically all of the media forms that were distributing their content separately. Television would go through a TV channel, radio would go through a radio receiver, newspapers you hold in your hand, film you go watch in a theater, your web pages you log onto. All of that is converging on the laptop and on the cell phone now. And so making sure that that information is flowing through the cell phone, through the laptop easily is all part of the challenge of convergence, especially when you have legacy media like radio and TV and film. They don't want their content to be automatically available for free on the internet. That's why it's so hard to find films, really, because they want to be in control of the distribution and the costs that are charged to access that content. And so ultimately, the European Union is trying to find a balance between competitiveness, make sure that the media market is still competitive, cultural diversity, preserving traditions like cheese making or British art or Polish nature, beautiful nature, cultural diversity or Mexican tile, and also consumer protection, making sure that people are not ripped off, that people are not paying unfair prices, people are not being, children are not being abused and convinced into purchasing things that they don't need. That's what the European Union is trying to handle through its policy. And that's going to wrap up our class today. Have a great day.